Sarah Mitchell had always believed in fairy tales. She met James at a charity gala in Boston, where he stood out among the crowd of wealthy donors with his charming smile and kind eyes. He spoke passionately about helping others, about building a better world. When he asked her to dance, she felt like the luckiest woman alive. Within 6 months, they were married in a ceremony that looked like something from a magazine. Her friends said she was living the dream. But dreams can turn into nightmares when you least expect it. The first time James hit her, he cried afterward. He begged for forgiveness, swearing it would never happen again. Sarah wanted to believe him. She told herself it was the stress from his job, the pressure of managing his family's business empire. She made excuses because love is supposed to conquer all, isn't it? That's what every movie and song had taught her. So she stayed. She forgave him. She convinced herself that the man she married was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the anger and violence. The second time was worse. The third time left her with a broken rib. By the fourth incident, Sarah had stopped counting. She wore long sleeves in summer and sunglasses indoors. Her friends stopped calling after she cancelled plans too many times. Her family lived across the country, and James had made sure they drifted apart, suggesting she was too busy to visit, intercepting phone calls, creating distance until she was completely isolated. The walls of their beautiful home became her prison, and James held the only key. Sarah knew she needed to leave. She had tried once before, packing a bag while James was at work. But he came home early, and what happened next made her understand that leaving might cost her life. He told her plainly that if she ever tried to run, he would find her. He had money, connections, and lawyers who could make her disappear legally or otherwise. She believed him because she had seen the darkness in his eyes, a cold emptiness that scared her more than his fists ever could. Then came the night that changed everything. James came home drunk, angrier than she had ever seen him. A business deal had fallen through, and he needed someone to blame. Sarah tried to stay out of his way, but in their house, there was nowhere to hide. The beating was brutal, systematic, methodical. He wasn't just angry this time. He was trying to kill her. She felt her consciousness fading as his hands wrapped around her throat. The edges of her vision darkened. She thought about her mother, about the life she could have lived, about all the warnings she had ignored. When she woke up, she was in the car. James was driving fast, too fast, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Blood dripped from her nose onto her shirt. Every breath sent sharp pain through her ribs. She didn't dare ask where they were going. Hours passed in terrifying silence as they drove through the night, leaving the city behind, heading west into territory she didn't recognize. The landscape changed from highways to back roads, from civilization to wilderness. Dawn was breaking when James finally spoke. His voice was calm now, which somehow made it worse. He told her they were going to visit his cabin in South Dakota, a place no one knew about. He said they needed time away from everything, that things would be better there. But Sarah knew the truth in her bones. This remote location wasn't a getaway. It was where he planned to finish what he started. She was being driven to her own grave. The morning sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, beautiful and indifferent to her terror. Sarah pressed her hand against the window, wondering if anyone would ever know what happened to her, if her disappearance would even be investigated, or if James's money and influence would simply erase her from existence. She closed her eyes and prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening. She had no idea that salvation was coming from an unexpected source, or that her life was about to intersect with a man whose ancestors had survived their own genocide, who understood suffering and resilience in ways she was only beginning to learn. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. Tall pines surrounded it, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that matched Sarah's despair. James dragged her inside by her arm, her legs barely supporting her weight. The cabin was sparse and cold, furnished with only the essentials. No neighbors for miles. No phone signal. No escape. He threw her onto a wooden chair in the kitchen and stood over her, breathing heavily. For a moment, she thought he might hit her again, but instead he grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the counter and took a long drink. His eyes were bloodshot, his face twisted with rage and something else she couldn't identify. Regret? Shame? It didn't matter. Whatever humanity he once possessed had long since died. James left her there and went into the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. Sarah sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Every part of her body screamed in agony. She was certain her ribs were broken, possibly other bones too. Her face was swollen, one eye nearly shut. She touched her throat gently, feeling the bruises already forming. She needed a hospital, but she knew James would never take her to one. Doctors asked questions. They called police. James couldn't risk that. Hours crawled by in suffocating silence. The sun moved across the sky, its light filtering weakly through the dirty windows. Sarah's mind raced through impossible scenarios. She could try to run, but where would she go? She could barely walk. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, and she had no idea which way led to civilization. She would die of exposure before she found help. She could try to find a weapon, something to defend herself with, but James was stronger, faster, and she had no strength left. Every option ended in her death. As afternoon faded into evening, James emerged from the bedroom. He had sobered up slightly, which only made him more dangerous. Drunk James was violent but sloppy. Sober James was calculating and cruel. He made himself dinner, ignoring her completely, as if she were already dead. She watched him move around the kitchen, this man she had once loved, this stranger wearing her husband's face. How had she missed the monster lurking beneath the surface? Or had he always been this way, just better at hiding it? When James finally spoke, his voice was eerily calm. He told her they would stay at the cabin for a while, that she needed to think about her behavior, about how she made him do these things. He blamed her for his violence, twisted logic that made her the villain in his story. Sarah had heard it all before, the manipulation, the gaslighting, but now his words felt like a eulogy. He was preparing his excuse, the story he would tell when people asked what happened to his wife. An accident in the woods. A fall. A tragedy. Poor James, widowed so young. That night, Sarah lay on the cold floor of the living room, James having taken the only bed. She was too afraid to close her eyes, certain that if she fell asleep, she might never wake up. The cabin creaked and groaned around her, the wind howling through the trees outside. She thought about her parents, about the call they would receive, about how James would play the grieving husband perfectly. She thought about all the choices that had led her to this moment, each small compromise, each ignored warning sign. Dawn came slowly, the sky turning gray before light finally broke through. Sarah heard James stirring in the bedroom. Her heart hammered against her broken ribs. This might be her last morning on earth. She struggled to sit up, her body protesting every movement. Through the window, she saw the forest awakening, birds calling to each other, deer moving cautiously through the trees. The world continued on, beautiful and indifferent. James came out of the bedroom, and Sarah saw something in his expression that chilled her blood. He had made a decision. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the cold determination in his eyes. He walked to the door, pulled on his boots, and grabbed his keys. He looked at her one final time. He told her he was going into town for supplies, that she better be here when he got back, though they both knew she had nowhere to go. He said he would be gone for a few hours. The door closed behind him. The engine started. The car pulled away. Silence fell over the cabin like a shroud. Sarah knew this was her only chance, possibly her last. If she stayed, she died. If she ran, she might die. But at least running gave her a chance, however slim. She forced herself to stand, gasping at the pain. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to fight, to survive. Sarah stumbled out of the cabin into the morning light, each step an agony that shot through her entire body. She had no plan, no map, no supplies. She wore only the blood-stained clothes from yesterday. But staying meant certain death, so she moved forward, letting instinct guide her away from the dirt road where James might return at any moment. She pushed into the forest, branches catching her clothes and scratching her already battered skin. The terrain was unforgiving. Roots threatened to trip her with every step. The ground sloped downward, and she had to grab trees to keep from falling. Her broken ribs made breathing difficult, each inhale a sharp reminder of her injuries. Sweat mixed with dried blood on her face. Her vision blurred, whether from her swollen eye or exhaustion, she couldn't tell. But she kept moving, driven by pure survival instinct, the same primal force that had kept humans alive for millennia. Time became meaningless in the forest. Minutes could have been hours. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the canopy in scattered beams. Sarah had no idea where she was going, only that she needed distance between herself and the cabin. She tried to move in a straight line, but the forest forced her to weave around obstacles, and soon she was hopelessly lost. The trees all looked the same. Every direction seemed equally unfamiliar. Panic began to claw at her chest. Her legs gave out after what might have been an hour or 3. She collapsed against a large pine tree, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Her vision swam. She was bleeding again, fresh blood seeping through her shirt. She knew she was dying. Even if James never found her, exposure and her injuries would finish the job. She had traded one death for another, but at least here, under open sky, she would die free. That small dignity felt important somehow. She must have lost consciousness because when she opened her eyes, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. The forest was quieter now, that strange afternoon stillness when even the birds seemed to nap. Sarah tried to stand but couldn't. Her body had reached its absolute limit. She thought about calling for help, but who would hear her out here? And what if James heard her instead? She closed her eyes again, accepting what was coming. At least she had tried. At least she had fought. The sound of footsteps snapped her back to consciousness. Terror flooded through her. James had found her. It was over. She tried to crawl away, but her arms wouldn't support her weight. The footsteps came closer, crunching through fallen leaves. She waited for his hands, his voice, his final violence. Instead, she heard a sharp intake of breath and words in a language she didn't understand. She forced her good eye open. A man stood before her, but it wasn't James. He was Native American, perhaps in his 60s, with long gray hair pulled back and deep-set eyes that held both wisdom and sorrow. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, looking like he belonged to the forest itself. He knelt beside her carefully, his movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal. He spoke again, this time in English, his voice gentle but commanding. He asked what happened, who did this to her. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She managed to say one word, husband. The man's face darkened with understanding and something that looked like old anger. He told her his name was Thomas Running Bear, that she was on the edge of the Pine Ridge Reservation, that he had been tracking a deer when he found her. He said he was going to help her, that she was safe now. Sarah wanted to believe him, but trust had been beaten out of her. She flinched when he reached toward her. Thomas saw her fear and nodded slowly, recognition in his eyes. He had seen this before, he told her. He knew what men could do to women, how they broke them down piece by piece. He spoke of his own daughter, lost to violence years ago, and how he had failed to save her. But he wouldn't fail Sarah. He promised this with such conviction that something in her broken heart stirred. Maybe she could trust him. Maybe not all men were monsters. He lifted her as gently as possible, though the movement still made her scream. He apologized but kept moving, carrying her through the forest with surprising strength for his age. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as he walked, catching glimpses of sky and trees, feeling the rhythm of his steady steps. She heard him singing softly in his native language, words she didn't understand but that felt like prayers. The sound was comforting, ancient, connecting her to something larger than her pain. Thomas carried Sarah to a small house at the edge of the reservation. It was simple but sturdy, surrounded by a garden that had been put to bed for winter. He brought her inside and laid her carefully on a couch, then immediately went to work. He moved with practiced efficiency, his hands steady and sure. Sarah learned later that he had been a medic in Vietnam, that he knew how to treat wounds and recognize when someone needed more help than he could provide. He cleaned her injuries with warm water and gentle pressure, murmuring apologies when she gasped in pain. He examined her ribs carefully, his face grave as his fingers found the breaks. He told her she needed a hospital, that her injuries were serious, possibly life-threatening. But when Sarah grabbed his arm in panic, begging him not to call anyone, not to let anyone know where she was, he understood. He had lived through enough violence to know that sometimes the law couldn't protect you, that sometimes the people who were supposed to help you failed. Instead, Thomas called his niece, a woman named Mary who worked as a nurse in Rapid City. She arrived within an hour, carrying a medical bag and asking no questions beyond what was necessary to treat Sarah. Between them, they cleaned and bandaged her wounds, wrapped her ribs, gave her antibiotics and pain medication. Mary examined her thoroughly, her professional demeanor cracking only when she saw the hand-shaped bruises around Sarah's neck. She and Thomas exchanged a long look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Mary told Sarah she had 3 cracked ribs, extensive bruising, a mild concussion, and numerous lacerations. She was severely dehydrated and malnourished. Her injuries were consistent with prolonged, systematic abuse. In a hospital, they would be required to report this to the police. But Mary understood, as Thomas had, that Sarah's greatest danger wasn't her injuries but the man who had caused them. So she treated Sarah in silence, showed Thomas how to continue care, and left medication with strict instructions. Before she left, she squeezed Sarah's hand and told her she was brave. Sarah, who hadn't felt brave in years, began to cry. For the first 3 days, Sarah barely moved from the couch. Thomas brought her food she could barely eat, water she forced down, medicine that dulled the pain but not the fear. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow looked like James. She asked Thomas repeatedly if he was sure no one had followed them, if he was certain James couldn't find her here. Thomas assured her that the reservation was sovereign land, that outsiders couldn't just wander in, that his community would protect her. But Sarah had learned that nowhere was truly safe. Thomas seemed to understand her fear without her having to explain it. He had lived through the occupation of Wounded Knee in the 70s, he told her, had seen his people terrorized by the FBI and federal marshals. He knew what it felt like to be hunted, to trust no one, to sleep with one eye open. He shared these stories not to compare traumas but to let her know she wasn't alone in her fear, that survival was possible even when everything seemed hopeless. On the fourth day, Sarah was strong enough to sit up for more than a few minutes. Thomas made her traditional Lakota soup, thick with buffalo meat and wild turnips. The smell alone was nourishing, earthy and rich. As she ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, Thomas told her about his daughter, speaking her name aloud for the first time in years. Her name had been Grace, and she had been killed by her boyfriend when she was just 23. Thomas had found her too late, had held her as she died, had carried that failure ever since. He told Sarah this not to burden her with his grief but to explain why he would do everything in his power to help her survive. Grace's death had broken something in him, but it had also forged something stronger. He had made a promise to her spirit that he would never again stand by when someone needed help. Sarah was his chance at redemption, though she tried to tell him he didn't need redeeming. But Thomas shook his head. He said the spirits had guided him to find her, that nothing happened by accident, that their paths had crossed for a reason. Sarah wanted to believe in spirits and fate, in some cosmic order that made sense of suffering. But mostly she just felt grateful for this stranger's kindness, for his refusal to turn away from her pain. She asked him what would happen when James came looking for her, because she knew he would. James didn't give up on things he considered his property. Thomas's expression hardened. He told her that many people had tried to destroy the Lakota nation, that his ancestors had survived genocide, that he knew how to protect what was sacred. Sarah was under his protection now, and that meant something. It meant everything. Sarah had been with Thomas for 2 weeks when James finally came. She was sitting in Thomas's kitchen, healing slowly, her bruises fading from purple to yellow-green, her ribs beginning to knit back together. She had started to believe she might actually survive this, might actually escape. That's when they heard the truck coming up the dirt road, engine revving aggressively, announcing its arrival like a threat. Thomas looked out the window and saw the expensive SUV, out of place among the modest vehicles on the reservation. He saw the white man behind the wheel, saw the rage contorting his face. He knew immediately who this was. He turned to Sarah, who had gone pale, her entire body trembling. He told her to go into the bedroom, to lock the door, to hide in the closet. But Sarah shook her head. She was done hiding. If this was the end, she would face it standing up. James burst through the front door without knocking, his expensive suit incongruous in Thomas's simple home. He looked around wildly until his eyes landed on Sarah. His face transformed from rage to relief to possessive fury in seconds. He started toward her, saying her name like a curse, telling her they were leaving, that she had embarrassed him enough. But Thomas stepped between them, his aged body blocking James's path. James looked at Thomas like he was an insect, something to be brushed aside. He told the old man to get out of his way, that this was between him and his wife, that he had no right to interfere. Thomas stood his ground, his voice steady and calm as he told James he wasn't welcome here, that Sarah was under his protection, that he needed to leave immediately. James laughed, a cruel sound that echoed in the small house. He asked what an old man was going to do to stop him. What happened next occurred so fast that Sarah almost missed it. James lunged toward Thomas, reaching to push him aside. But Thomas moved with the speed and precision of a trained fighter, using James's momentum against him. Within seconds, James was face down on the floor, Thomas's knee in his back, his arm twisted at an angle that made him cry out. Thomas's voice was still calm as he explained that he had learned hand-to-hand combat in Vietnam, that he had spent decades studying Aikido, that violence had been part of his life long before James was born. By now, neighbors had heard the commotion. Several men appeared in the doorway, including 2 tribal police officers. Thomas explained the situation in quick, efficient sentences. He showed them Sarah's still visible injuries. He told them about the attempted assault. The officers looked at James with open contempt. They knew about men like him, men who thought money and skin color gave them the right to do anything. They told James he was trespassing on sovereign land, that he had committed assault, that he was under arrest. James's face went purple with rage and disbelief. He screamed about his lawyers, his connections, how he would sue everyone involved. He threatened the officers, Thomas, even Sarah. But his words fell on deaf ears. The tribal police had jurisdiction here, and they took violence against women seriously, especially in a community that had lost too many daughters, mothers, and sisters to similar brutality. They dragged James out to their vehicle while he shouted threats and obscenities. The sound of his voice fading into the distance was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. In the aftermath, Thomas helped Sarah contact a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases. The evidence was overwhelming: the photographs Mary had taken of Sarah's injuries, the medical records, Thomas's testimony. Even James's money and influence couldn't overcome the truth. Sarah filed for divorce and a permanent restraining order. The tribal police shared their report with federal authorities. James faced charges in multiple jurisdictions. The legal process was long and exhausting, but Sarah was no longer fighting alone. Thomas connected her with resources on the reservation, women who had survived similar situations, therapists who understood trauma. The community, despite having every reason to distrust outsiders after centuries of broken treaties and stolen land, embraced her. They understood survival. They understood resilience. They taught her that healing wasn't about forgetting but about learning to carry the weight of the past without letting it crush you. 6 months later, Sarah stood in Thomas's garden, helping him prepare the soil for spring planting. Her divorce was final. James was serving time for assault and facing additional charges. She had started therapy, found a job in a nearby town, begun the slow process of rebuilding her life. The physical scars were fading, but she knew the emotional ones would take longer. Maybe they would never fully heal. But she was alive, and that was everything. Thomas worked beside her in comfortable silence, occasionally offering advice about which vegetables grew best in South Dakota soil. Sarah looked at this man who had saved her life, who had asked for nothing in return, who had given her back her humanity when she thought it was lost forever. She tried to thank him again, but he waved her words away. He told her that in Lakota tradition, all life is connected, that helping her had helped him heal too, had honored his daughter's memory, had fulfilled a promise he made long ago. As the sun set over the reservation, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah realized she had found something she never expected: not just survival, but a new family, a new purpose, a new understanding of what strength really meant. She had been minutes from death, destroyed by a man who claimed to love her. But she had been saved by a stranger whose own people had survived attempted genocide, who understood that the greatest act of defiance against those who would destroy you is simply to keep living, to keep growing, to keep believing that tomorrow might be better than today.